Good morning. Let's have a quick little law talk, alright? Because something's happening right now that I have paused and DVRing that many people might not know about. And that's an issue because it's something that actually affects our communities pretty strongly. At 7:04 this morning, Congress, the Senate Judiciary Committee, started to hear testimony on whether or not they should change the sentencing for crack cocaine versus cocaine. Now, you might be saying, Marissa, why do we want to change the punishments for drugs like crack and cocaine? Aren't those issues? Yeah. We don't want people using crack and cocaine, but we also don't want the racial disparities that we have right now in the punishment. And a lot of people don't realize that right now it's not an equal punishment. If you have crack or if you have cocaine, you're not sentenced the same, right? It's called an 18-to-1 ratio, where if you have a certain amount of one substance, you then go into the 18-to-1 policy, meaning that if you had 1 gram of crack, it is treated as if you had 18 grams of powder cocaine, right? Crack is the crystal that is mixed with something that becomes the crystallized form versus powder cocaine. So, again, 18-to-1. So 1 gram crack equals 18 grams of cocaine. And these are the federal punishments, not your state punishments. But then you think, like, well, I'm in Oregon or I'm in New York, right? I'm not going to get these crazy punishments. Why should I care what the federal government's doing? Well, because the federal government can override your state. The federal government can come into your state and treat you under the federal sentencing. So that's what's happening for cannabis in a lot of ways, is that there are still raids happening. There are still times where the federal government can come into somebody's home with a federal warrant and take their plants that they're growing. So just because your state is doing one thing, or if your state is liberal or has a certain attitude toward drugs, it doesn't mean that these federal policies aren't going to affect you and your community. So let's just have a quick breakdown of how we got to this 18-to-1 and then what the Senate is doing right now. So quickly, the 1980s were when drug policies went off the grid, went crazy. And this idea that drugs are inherently dangerous and terrible and everyone needs to go to jail for them is very much a 1980s theory that never died, right? It just grew and it's kept going and it's never stopped. And now we're reflecting on these policies, but we're reflecting sort of hesitantly. And as my generation is coming to the forefront in political thinking and becoming new members of Congress and Senate, we need to be aware of our congressional history, but also we need to be aware of what's happening right now and how it's affecting our communities so that we can get involved and make change as to these policies. So in 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act came into effect. And a big reason why this program was put into effect was because the federal government believed that the big issue with urban violence and population growth was due to crack cocaine. And yes, there was a large use of crack cocaine, undeniably. And it was something that the government hadn't really seen before because crack was so much cheaper than powder cocaine. And it became such a big product on the black market or the illicit market. But the Anti-Abuse Act that came into effect in 86 created at first it had a death penalty requested for crack dealers. Now that's intense to kill somebody for dealing a drug, but we don't have that anymore. But what happened was a 100-to-1 policy came into effect. So your 1 gram of crack became the equivalent of 100 grams of powder cocaine. Now the reasoning behind this is kind of crazy, why somebody thought that 100-to-1 really made sense at the time. So they said, 1, crack is more addictive, so let's put them away longer. 2, it leads to violence, so even if you haven't become violent because of crack, but you possess it, the government felt that you sort of have this repressed violence that will come to the forefront when you use crack, so let's put you away longer. 3, it was getting in the hands of youth, though there was no real evidence that youth had been in touch with powder or crack more, just that the communities they were looking at, they believed that it was getting in the hands of youth, and therefore, because the fourth reason was that it was cheaper, so now young people have it, and it's cheaper, so therefore they're going to be using it more. And then five, the idea and the term crack babies came out, that pregnant mothers were using crack and having crack babies. It's sort of like that Reagan image of the welfare lady that was using all the welfare to herself, and that's what the average welfare user looked like, even though most welfare consumers were white instead of African American. That idea of like the crack mother, the welfare woman, the inner city neighborhood, that was what this act was meant for, was to find those people and put them in jail for a lot longer than the white kids who were probably able to afford powder cocaine. So my personal belief, but it's indisputable, was that this act was racist. It was blatantly a racist act. Then, in 2009, now we have this policy for a long time. We have 100-1, up until actually 2010 and 2009 is when it really changed. But okay, so let's go back one more second. In 2007, the Supreme Court heard a case called Kimber v. United States, and the late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually had an opinion that I don't agree with. And what this case did was, one, it did allow for local judges who were hearing cases about crack cocaine to have a little wiggle room in the sentencing, because normally it's the jury or the judge who sentences somebody who's been convicted. But federal minimum sentencing laws, like the 100-1, affected their decision, and it, in essence, didn't give them anything to decide. It said, this is what I have to give you. So the Supreme Court said you need to allow judges to have that sort of wiggle room, but the question of whether the 100-1 ratio was unconstitutional as a cruel and unusual punishment was decided that it was not. The Supreme Court said the 100-1 is fine because Congress made it. If Congress wants to change it, Congress go change it. Whereas the court are not going to change it. Whereas I would have preferred Ruth Bader Ginsburg to have said, this is absolutely unconstitutional, 100-1 for no reason. But the court didn't. And you can look that case up, Kimber v. United States in 2007. And the Supreme Court just heard a case on it called Terry v. United States. And kind of only good thing you could read in that case is Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote beautifully and eloquently about the racial disparities. And that's what we have to think about mostly here, is in 2009, the United States Sentencing Commission did a study of the people who were put in jail for crack cocaine versus cocaine. And they found that 79% of the people put away for crack cocaine were African Americans. 79%. 79% is basically something, a grade that most people would accept on a paper or something. It's not what we accept in racial disparities. There should not be 79%. You should not be able to say 4 out of every 5 people put away for crack cocaine is African American. But that's where we're at. In 2009, there was the Fairness in Cocaine Sentencing Act that was put into play. And instead of 100-1, we have 18-1. And that was solidified in 2010 with the Fair Sentencing Act. And so now we have 18-1. You know what that still means? Those same 79% of African Americans are put in jail for a little bit less than they were before. So there's a bill being put before Congress, the Equal Sentencing Act. And what this is to do is bring down that disparity, to level the playing field. 1-1 ratio is the goal, because it's pretty obscene to go to jail for 100 times more than a crime that is so equivalent and is made up of so much of the same similar compounds, especially because cocaine in our scheduling system is Schedule 2. Cannabis is Schedule 1. So now as we see these reforms for cannabis, we need to make sure that that also hits other drugs as well. And we need to look at it from an educated perspective. So if it's not saying, oh, I want to make sure this gets in the hands of more people, I want to put it in stores. No, we're not saying that that's what we want to do with crack and cocaine. But what we do want to do, and what we do want to be cognizant of, is that our policies don't affect communities because of bias and prejudice and false information. 79% of African Americans were the people put away under these policies for crack cocaine. That's unacceptable. Completely unacceptable, and it proves that the only real reason behind these laws was racism, because that's what it's affected, and we've kept it for so long that if from 1986 to 2001 we still have 4 out of 5 people sentences for crack cocaine being African American, we haven't changed anything and we haven't grown. The 18-1 just meant they were in jail a little bit longer, a little bit less than they would have before, which is still not acceptable. It's like diluting racism, but not really. So now that Congress is hearing this, now that Congress is talking about this, it's a very, very, very Republican crowd on the Senate committee listening. And most of them don't want to make these changes because they believe it's going to incentivize use, or it's going to make getting these drugs easier. But there's no proof that there's anything connected between those two, that the sentencing actually means that people will use it more. People are going to use it, they're just not aware that their sentencing is 18-1. The way that our policies need to be focused is on rehabilitation and on programs for people who have addiction, and on social welfare programs to make sure that people don't think of selling crack as a commodity or their only way of selling them. They talk about the recidivism rate when you come out of jail for crack, that people go back and sell it again. Well, you put them in jail for X amount of time, you don't give them any programs when they come out, any assistance, and now they have a felony on the books. So what kind of job can they get? They go back to what they know, something that they had been successful with making money before. So it shows that the sentencing policy is so much larger than just saying you did something wrong, let me put you in jail. It affects entire communities disproportionately, and it affects African Americans in a way that a lot of people in the white community can't even imagine. You can't imagine 4 out of 5 of your friends going to jail for one drug. So what I want everyone to do is just keep this in mind, be cognizant of these policies, and reach out to your congressmen and your senators and say, you want to hear more, you want to hear their beliefs, and when you come to your own conclusions, let them know that, because they're speaking for you, and say, this isn't what I believe, I don't like what's happening, I want to see change. So help be a part of that, and stay engaged, stay involved, stay educated, and help be a leader. Thank you very much.